Hello guys, it's been a while since I've recorded some gameplay videos for you, and if you followed our news updates you probably know why. Uh, on February 24th, Russian army invaded Ukraine, and so a lot of things have happened since then, but I'm recording this 5 months after the war started, uh, late July. So our team is more or less fine given the circumstances. We keep working from our office in Kiev, and this is a charity project that we've decided to do on our it's non-profit, so we don't plan to gain any money from it. And so this is Ukraine War Stories, a set of 3 visual novels that tell the stories based on what actually happened in 3 towns and cities in Ukraine, namely in Hostomel, Bucha and Mariupol. So today I'll make a playthrough of the um, Hostomel one, which is in the demo that you all can download and play, and there are different outcomes possible, so today you'll see only one and you can explore it for yourself. And I really encourage everyone to wishlist the project and share the information about it, because we are trying to do as much spread the information about it as much as possible, so that when the full project with 3 stories will be released on Steam in October in 8 languages, like the more wish lists and players we have at that time, the more people on Steam will see it, because Steam promotes the game, the more people play the game, the more people will see the game. So basically all our efforts right now are aimed at making sure that a lot of people will see this game and these visual novels, etc. And we've added the sources section. So basically, of course, each story is a combination of real stories, and characters have like different names, etc. And some stories are a combination of several, but we have proofs for all events that some similar things have actually happened in that location. So you can click sources in the main menu and see a list with links to some credible sources that such events have actually, or similar events have actually happened. So when all 3 stories will be released, there will be like 3 buttons, one for each story, with sources that support events of each story. So one of our basically one guy from our team was actually living in occupation for 1 week with his family in Bucha. So we have eyewitness accounts right in our team. So for his family, they got out successfully, but many people were not so lucky. So yeah, it's really horrible things are happening right now in Ukraine. So yeah, but let's start the actual gameplay, and I'll read out loud, and we'll be only following like one possible line of events, but there are different possible outcomes, so feel free to download the free demo and explore it for yourself. Okay, so let's get started. Evening in February. It was barely past 5 p.m., but it was getting dark already. Spring was on its way in, but we were still getting early sunsets and cold nights. Another quiet evening in the house that was entirely too big for just me and my Lilia. Ever since our daughter had settled in Kiev, No surprises there, Hostomel was always too small for her. Still, she kept in touch with us. In fact, that evening I was just trying to figure out a present from her, a smartphone. Well, I wasn't trying anymore. I delegated the task to the neighbor's girl, Milena Mirzayan. Milena is a bright girl, top of her class at the medical university in Kiev, much younger than my own daughter Katya, barely in her 20s, quick-witted and full of life, unlike me, a tired old man. I've been an aviation engineer for 40 years before retiring, and yet these modern gadgets are beyond anything I've worked with. Now my wife Lilia, she is the savvy one, but that evening she was preoccupied. Alexei, she said in a worried voice, Alexei, have you heard that Putin is saying he recognized those republics in Donbass? She clutched at her chest. Oh God, the Russians are going to invade. I looked over to see her watching a Russian broadcast on YouTube, and I could only roll my eyes. For the last few weeks, what Putin was saying was everyone's favorite gossip, that a big war was coming, that the Russians were finally going to invade in full force. That's why Milena left Kiev a day ago and came to join her parents in Hostomel. Many people fled the capital in the last few days. It was as if everybody expected Kiev to be bombed off the face of the earth. Lily, please. Nothing's gonna happen, I said when I caught Milena's glance. She was afraid too. Mr. Borisov, they've got so many troops on our borders, they wouldn't keep them there if they were just bluffing. That's exactly how bluff works, child, I chuckled. You have nothing to fear because... Well, so now we came to the point where we have to make a choice. So in the first chapter it's more like narrative choice, but later on it affects the gameplay in a significant way. So here, well, actually I'll be also like sharing some of my personal experiences while playing this. So of course we've all discussed the possible war and everything before it started. And I've talked with our CEO Igor about it, and like we've discussed who would do what if that happens, etc. So basically, since our company was developing a number of war game titles in World War II setting before, I've read lots of like history books and memoirs and everything, and so I knew the World War II history quite well, and that's why I was thinking that the forces Russia have amassed on Ukrainian borders are significant, but not enough to take over the entire country, and there would be fierce resistance, so it's not likely they will occupy large portion of the country, and especially large cities would be very problematic for them. So I was, let's say, relatively optimistic in that regard, and I said that basically they wouldn't be able to take Kiev or something. So even if they do invade, that sounds a bit foolish. With the forces they had, so I thought that it was also in part bluff, in part they would probably invade further in Donbass area, because that's operation the scale, like for operation of that scale they would have had enough forces, but they've like vastly overestimated their strengths and vastly underestimated Ukraine's resistance. So they've expected a very big resistance, and that's why they thought that these forces would be enough, which is quite foolish if you ask me. But still, so when I talked with Igor, he agreed that they wouldn't be able like to take over Ukraine, but at the same time he said like, I cannot go to the office and work there thinking that the missile could hit like the kindergarten and kill my daughter while she's there. So, and you know, this saying was somewhat prophetic, because when the war started, Igor made sure that his family, basically moved his family out of Ukraine and then came back and keeps working from our Kiev office. But his family is safe abroad. And in June, or was it actually May? Yeah, in June, 26 June, the Russian missile actually hit a playground near the kindergarten where his daughter his daughter was attending before. So his words, like a couple of days before the war, were like, fortunately not prophetic, but actually quite close. So that's an interesting coincidence, I would say. Well, anyway, so basically these are 4 options. One is the right time for the attack has passed, and that's partially true, but it's not that significant probably. That spring is not the best time to invade because of thaw and bad roads. Putin will try to annex Donbass at most. Well, that makes sense. At least it made sense back then. If Putin invades the UN, will eat him alive? Well, not that he was too worried about that. He've already done that a couple of times and nobody ate him, so that's a good argument, but I would say rather weak one. And he doesn't have nearly enough forces. That's like exactly what I've been saying. And you know, when our like narrative designers were writing this, they wrote this like variants, I think, on their own. And when I saw this variant, I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. So yes, this is my variant, I would say. So let's choose this one. He can't take the entire Ukraine with so few men. If his generals can count, they'll tell him 200,000 men isn't enough to take the entire Ukraine. I tried giving the girls a reassuring smile. In retrospect, it may have looked a little smug. You know, at least I took first aid courses and stocked us up on some goes that will be useful, right, darling? She looked at Milena, who replied with enthusiastic nodding. You could have done something useful as well instead of buying more model planes. I just chuckled. I could tell she was just worried. She didn't mean it one bit. Look, if you're so worried, I'll go get the car fueled up, say, on Thursday. We weren't using our car much, except to buy groceries, so the near empty tank didn't seem like an issue. With my bum leg, I barely left home anyway, and Lilia worked as a teacher. Her students were all on distance learning. Yeah, so couple of notes here. So first of all, it's not apparent from maybe people outside Ukraine, but every user from Ukraine would know that on Thursday, that's when the invasion actually started, early morning. So saying that his car will be filled up on Thursday, that's a bit ironic. And also distance learning, well, we all know that there was like the last 2 years were crazy because of COVID and everything. So, you know, in Ukraine it was like from bad to worse, literally, because we went from COVID to war. But yeah, that's like why they were on distance learning. Then we'll go have a vacation in the Carpathians, a week, no, 2 weeks, until this whole deal resolves itself, and you'll see that I was right. Stocking up on fuel is a good idea, Milena chimed in. My dad is stocking up as well before the prices rise even more. I nodded. I didn't believe war was coming, and if I did, could I do anything to prevent it? But there was something I could do, help everyone stay calm. Okay, so Milena's and Lilia's mood increased, and let's go to chapter 2. Worst day of the war. There was a deafening noise outside, wresting me from sleep instantly. At first, I didn't believe my own ears. I thought I hadn't woken up at all and this was all a nightmare. But then I heard the noise again. Explosions. Oh god, Lyosha, they're bombing the airfield. Look, those helicopters are shooting rockets. I looked around and saw my wife. She was already running toward the window. Did she hear it first? She was always the quicker thinker between us two. After a night of sleep, stepping on my bum leg felt even worse than usual. I limped towards Lily and looked into the window. I didn't have the eyesight to make out the details, but I saw helicopters swarming over the Hostomel airfield, launching bright flares all around them. Not rockets, flares. They do it so our soldiers don't shoot them down. They're fixing to deploy the airborne troops. Lily covered her mouth with her hands and looked at me. I don't think I've ever seen her so confused and scared. Pack our things, we might have to leave the town. Yeah, so basically at that day there were like around 30 helicopters dropping airborne troops near Hostomel airfield, so the plan was to bring in stealthily with low flying helicopters a bunch of troops, like maybe around 400 men. They would take over the airfield and then they would land there a bunch of large planes with lots of airborne troops inside and heavy weapons, etc. But our troops reacted in time and basically planes had to change route and land in Belarus. So they weren't able to carry out this operation, and these guys that were landed from helicopters were all taken out. So it wasn't a successful operation in the end. As my wife ran around the house packing up everything of any value, I was trying to process what was happening. The war had begun. I had seen it with my own eyes, but I still couldn't comprehend it. I was so convinced that the Russians would never act upon their threats. What a fool I've been. There was a gunfire coming from the airfield. It snapped me back to reality. I had to do something. When I went to check up on Lily, I saw her hands were shaking. I had to calm her down, or at least make sure that she didn't forget to pack anything important. On the other hand, I've never got around to refueling our car and only had enough petrol to drive to the nearest fueling station. Well, we have three options. So basically we can help Lily pack up, and at the bottom you can see that we'll get some extra medicine. We can ask neighbors for gasoline. Basically we'll get fuel, and we can comfort Lily. That would increase her mood, and we'll pack some extra sweets. So I guess everyone would probably try to go for, not everyone maybe, but at least, that seems logical to go for gasoline anyway. So let's, Alexei promised to do so before, so let's make good on our promise and go look for gasoline, I guess. Getting gasoline was my first priority. I got dressed, told Lily where I was going, and went to visit our closest neighbors. I knocked on their door, then called out a few times, nothing. I swore silently and limped towards the next house. In about an hour I'd visited all of our neighbors. Most of them had left the town, while others were packing up or waiting for their relatives to join them. They all told me to evacuate as far as possible somewhere abroad, or at least to the western part of Ukraine. The Russians weren't going to get that far, they said. Naturally, nobody had any gasoline to spare. I was heading home when someone called out my name. It was David Mirzayan, the neighbor whose house I had visited first. He just came back home after stocking up at one of the grocery stores he owned in town. Good day, Alexei. Have you seen how our boys kicked those Ruskis to the curb? He was merry and excited. Must have been the nerves, I thought, while David kept talking. The Russian landed there airborne and left, can you imagine, just left their troops to fend for themselves. Our boys destroyed them on the ground. I wasn't convinced, it sounded too good to be true. To snap David back to reality, I asked him about gasoline. Oh, of course, here you go. He got a full jerry can out of his car's trunk and gave it to me. But if I were you, I would stay put. They say the Russians who survived scattered into the woods. Personally, I'd let our boys smoke them out first, he smiled. David bid me farewell and went home to reassure his wife, who seemed to be scared same as Lily was. And me? I believed him and I stayed put. If I'm being honest, I just wanted to believe that it would all sort out itself in a couple of days. I'll never forgive myself for not getting Lilia out of Hostomel on that same day. So we've got us some fuel, and our mood is not so bright anymore. The neighbors. Alexei, what will we do? Lilia complained, sniffing away the last of her tears. Did you hear it? Did you hear how loud it was? How terrible. I nodded and hugged Lilia closer. I sure heard it. Around 3 a.m., when we were sleeping in the basement, a shell hit our house. I don't know what it was, but it shook the whole place. I was crawling around and looking for my cane, wondering if we should stay put or run, while Lilia was covering her ears and screaming. Then, when we were sure the walls weren't tumbling down on us, she started crying. This would all be over soon, I hope, but at that time all I could do was hold her close. Well, I've been in Kiev throughout the war, so me and my mother didn't leave the town. My girlfriend and her mother actually left maybe after 10 days, but now they are back. They've spent a few months in Poland. Basically, in my district in Kiev, it was more or less quiet, but first couple of weeks were really hectic because no one knew what to expect, and there were a lot of air alerts and missile strikes on Kiev and other cities, and so everyone were really scared and went to hide to the bomb shelter every hour or two. So yeah, it was very hectic and a lot of turmoil going on, and a lot of I would say chaos. Well, it was more or less organized, but so I don't know, it's hard to tell. It's like chaos, and some things were organized, some were chaotic. Yeah, but many people were trying to leave the city, and there were huge traffic jams if you try to go out by car. So yeah, and of course lots of people at the railroad station. So I've recorded a talk on that on the Games Gathering Game Dev Under Bombs event, so you can find it on YouTube, where I tell about our team experiences during the first months of the war. I'll probably add this in descriptions on YouTube for this video, but if you're watching it on Steam, then you could probably find it on YouTube. Yeah, so let's keep reading. The very next morning, when the fighting had quieted down, I heard a knock on our basement door. Our neighbors came to visit us, the whole Mirzayan family, Milena and her parents. Alexei, Lilia, David, the father of the family, walked up to me and firmly shook my hand. How are you two doing? Are you alright? We saw your house get hit. Thank the Almighty you weren't there. No kidding, I sighed. I have to leave, David. It's getting too dangerous. David's wife Olga chimed in. We can't leave, Alexei Fedorovich. We've spoken with the Territorial Defense Office. They said it's too dangerous. There is already talk about Russians shooting at cars. I wanted to curse. I couldn't believe that I was what I was hearing. Sure, the war had been going for 8 years now, but it was in Donbass on the edge of the country. Now the Russians were taking their planes and tanks and bombs all the way up to Kiev. I shook my head. Tell me, did they take the Antonov airport? If they did, well, the Hostomel is actually like sort of suburb for Kiev, so of course if they are taking this town, then they are really close to the capital. And basically the way they got so close is they invaded from Belarus territory, and they went straight across the Chernobyl restricted area, which is like was off limits due to high radiation before. Right now the radiation levels is not so high, but there are places where it's still very high. And we've heard reports of some Russian soldiers like digging into the ground there, and they got some like basically illnesses from radiations because of that, because no sane person would do that there, but they didn't know. And when some of them were taken prisoners, they used maps of like 1985, and the Chernobyl station exploded in 1987, so they used maps that were created before the Chernobyl explosion, so Chernobyl atomic plant. So basically they didn't like know that they were going across the like exploded atomic plant territory. So that sounds really dumb, but that's how it was. Yeah, so but that allowed them to move really fast and close to the Ukraine's capital Kiev, where I live, and where I now record this video. If they did take Antonov airfield, the road to Kiev would be wide open. We'd be seeing thousands, if not tens of thousands, of men and vehicles rolling out in the next few days. No, my friend, they didn't. It's quite a story, really, David said, and motioned for his wife and daughter to carry on without him. They brought us some supplies and took them downstairs. David, meanwhile, told me the news. They had yet to make it to the TV, but the gossip had already spread around town. The Russians took the Antonov airport, but it's all shelled to bits, unusable. They won't be landing anything here or using any of our planes. I gasped, and David cut himself off. He didn't need to continue. Mriya 2? Is it gone? I've worked for the Antonov Design Bureau for 40 years. Aviation was my life, still is, however little of that life is left in me. And nothing the Antonov Bureau ever made came even close to the AN-225 Mriya, the biggest cargo plane ever designed, a marvel of engineering. Soviet, Ukrainian, it didn't matter. Mriya was a treasure. Well, Mriya, it's like Ukrainian word for dream, so in English it would probably be written like AN-125 Dream. So yeah. I thought it was a terrible waste if it was barely flown in our 3 decades of independence, but that day I learned of a truly terrible waste. If you're interested, you can look up this plane, and there are videos on YouTube. It's like really huge, like indeed by far the largest transport aircraft in the world. So if you are curious, you can look it up. And yeah, it was destroyed on the airfield. And the cost of rebuilding it is just enormous, actually. I felt a sting in my chest and clutched at it. David quickly rushed to support me. He helped me sit down on the ground. I couldn't talk at first, so he continued. What a rotten world, huh? I told my girl to wait out the war in Hostomel if it came, and now the war has come here. He reached into his jacket's inner pocket, and before I knew it, there was a bottle in his hand. I was appalled at first, drinking at a time like this, but David kept talking. Nothing is sacred to those Russians. Destroying Maria is bad enough, but you know what they do to women? If the Russians get here, if they do, I can't calm my girls down and I can't protect them either. I don't even have a gun. He reached to uncork the bottle, drawing my attention to it. It was the finest Armenian cognac money could buy. Well, my personal view on this was that in my family, like when everyone were really stressed out at first during the first days and sort of tricky something, I was firmly against that, and I've promised myself that I won't be drinking anything even closely related to alcohol until the end of the war. And so 5 months have passed and I still keep that promise. So, but not that I was drinking much before, but you know, I could drink some little bit on some occasion, I would say. Never getting drunk actually, but I don't know, just yeah, but now I don't even like think about it until the war ends. So yeah, so we have 3 variants. Fine, let's go to your place though. If Lilia catches us drinking, we are dead men. Then save the bottle for a better time. That probably I would do. When the war is over, we'll all celebrate, but not before. That's like my personal choice for now in real life. And the third option is maybe let's gather everyone for a drink. If everyone is worried we shouldn't hoard the cognac. Well, it probably could work for some people to drink a little bit too, but like my reasoning why I was against it was that like first you drink and you sort of relax, and then again it works differently for different people, so it's not good for everyone. But then like next day when it wears off, you're like even more depressed, so it's better to try to cope with the stress on your own than to depend on some, like, let's say any type of drugs for it, and then like you get even more stressed out and you need to drink again, and then you get even more stressed out, so it's sort of a vicious circle, you know. So it's better not to go that route actually. So my choice would be save the bottle for a better time. Maria was a terrible loss. I didn't know what to think about it, but drawing my sorrow in alcohol was not an option. If David was so sure the war would only last a few days, I said, surely his cognac was better spent celebrating victory. I totally agree with that. David frowned but had to agree. He even told me to keep the bottle, that way he'd be sure it survived until our victory. He wasn't wrong there. I barely drank and we never kept any alcohol at home, so when I came to the basement to stash the bottle, Lilia had some questions. It's a gift from David Mirzayan. He said we'll open it when it's time to celebrate our victory, I said. I didn't tell her about the Mria. Lily gave me a sideways look, but soon realized I was being honest. She smiled. That's a wonderful idea. Give him my thanks. The day drew to a close, and me and David were parting ways just before the curfew. Shots were already ringing out somewhere far. The night, like the one before it, was going to get loud. Suddenly we hear the sound of approaching vehicles. What do you know? Our armed forces have finally arrived, David asked and looked out onto the road. Then his face dropped. As the armored vehicles rolled down the road, we could see the bright white Z letters painted on them. Yeah, so we've got ourselves some alcohol stashed. David's mood is dropped a little bit, but Lilia is now in a better mood since we didn't make a alcohol party there. The Russians. It's been a week since the war had begun, just a week, an entire week. Time seemed to have slowed down, and every new day that came seemed longer than the last. Deep inside, my fear was growing. Fear for myself, my family, my home, my country, fear for the future. We heard bombs exploding outside and wondered if the next one would hit us and if we would survive it. This constant wait for death left us with neither energy nor willingness to do anything. Well, as I've said, the first couple of weeks was really crazy because we would just, go to the bomb shelter and back and grab something to eat in between and maybe catch some sleep. And it would be interrupted by 3 or 4 alerts and going to the basement again. Basically, I live in a high apartment building, and so we could go to the -3rd level of parking, of underground parking, basically, that was suited for the bomb shelter purposes. And indeed, we had only time to check the news, go back and forth between apartment and basement, and eat something, and it was like that every day, so it was sort of blended into one large day. I think the first task that I had outside of this routine of going back and forth and I don't know, grabbing something to eat and catch some sleep was actually to make sure that all guys from Starni Games team get their salary. So it was my task to transfer money to everyone. So that was my first going a little bit back to the job. So at first couple of weeks it was 100% just making sure that you have enough food storages, going down to bomb shelter during air alerts, going to some local shops to buy some extra food supplies, making sure that you have everything packed up if you need to leave, making sure that your family is as safe as possible, calling your friends and relatives to know how they are doing, calling your colleagues to know, or typing messages to your colleagues to know how they are doing, something like that. Then I would say you start doing some most necessary tasks, and bit by bit you start doing something about your work, etc. Start working a bit, and then because first days there were a torrent of news every day, but then things started to sort of settle down a little bit, and the torrent of news was slowing down a bit, and so you had a little bit more breathing room to do something else. And so we started working remotely first. I would say we like sort of more or less fully recovered like 1 month after the war started, but for few people it was longer. One of them was Alexander Andreychuk, who was actually Hostomel and Bucha, these are basically almost one town. They are like two towns very close to each other. And so Alexander and his family like went to Bucha because they thought it was safer there, and his girlfriend came over from Kiev, so that's like very similar to what we have in the story. And they've been actually in the town when it was taken over by the Russians, and so they were hiding there. And we all were very worried about Alexander because we knew he was there, and there was like no connection with him for about a week or so. And then afterwards he like let us know that they safely got out during the evacuation, but it was very risky, and so we all were like really happy that they've managed to get out alive. Basically, of course, their like house was, and when they were leaving, so they were hiding it under the garage with this some maybe like a few streets away from their house actually. And his like parents went to check out the house and saw that Russians were like living there and I don't know, like taking some stuff there and so on. So they didn't risk like going in. They came back after this territory was liberated and saw what basically happened. So I think Alexander told me that his room was named V Club. Maybe they had some parties there, I don't know. And everything was turned around, and the interesting thing is that they even, if they couldn't like take your TV, they would shot through it, so that it was rendered inoperable anyway. So some interesting details from him about all that. But yeah, but let's not go that far. I just wanted to tell that like the time is sort of didn't mean anything at first. Like the first couple of weeks were really like blurry, dizzy state when like you lost track of time, of days, etc. But then as things started to settle down a little bit and we sort of got hang of the situation, I've started to work a little bit, and then it's slowly grew. So like the less I was checking news, the more I could dedicate myself to work, and it was actually helping because you could concentrate on something you know and something you can do, and it would really help like serves like an anchor in the difficult situation, like help your mind like get away from that constant torrent of worrying news and concentrate on making something. So that really helped, and I think people who couldn't work at all because they're like they couldn't get to work, or they had to move to other town, or their office was destroyed or something, they were in a much worse situation because they couldn't be preoccupied with something. So, if they were safe, of course, but still. All we did was keep checking the news. I don't know what we wanted to see there, as good news were in short supply, but any new information served to distract us from the horrors around us. That's what we were doing sitting in our basement when my phone rang. Me and Lily flinched from the sound. The happy melody our daughter picked for the ringtone sounded terribly out of place. Sacrilegious even. It was David, our neighbor. Alexei, hide your phone. The Ruskies are going around town, taking them away. He hung up and I quickly hid the phone under the floorboards. David's timing was impeccable. Upstairs in our house we heard a loud crash and heavy footsteps. The Russians broke into our house. We turned off the light, leaving me and Lily in total darkness, and listened. Lyosha, what do we do? Lily whispered. I heard growing panic in her voice. In the dark, I found her hand and squeezed it. Let's be quiet. Maybe they'll leave us alone. Corporal. Yeah, we weren't so lucky. In a few moments, someone knocked at the basement door. It was a heavy sound. They must have been knocking with the rifles' butt. Open up! Quick, or we're breaking the door. I didn't want to let the Russians in, but I didn't want to antagonize armed men either. We had to turn on the lights and open the door. 3 Russian soldiers descended into the basement. They were armed and looked ready to use their weapons at the drop of a hat. Lily backed away from them, and so did I, using a wall for support. One of the soldiers noticed my limp. What's wrong with your leg, man? He must have thought it was a combat wound. Hurts to step on it, an old injury. Spent half my life with a cane. He nodded and looked around our basement. We're searching the houses looking for Nazis and saboteurs. Do you know any Nazis in this city? Well, here you have 3 options. Give them a false lead. Plenty of empty houses in town, let them search there. Play dumb, whatever it takes to get them off our back. And tell them they're being lied to. They can't actually believe their own propaganda. Well, from personal experience, I know that convincing people who are like blinded by propaganda is a lengthy process. It can be done, but it requires some time and some convincing. You cannot do that like in over one conversation usually. So yeah, so that's not realistic. If they do believe their propaganda, they wouldn't be convinced by an old man telling them otherwise, especially the ones they treat with suspicion. So that's impossible. I mean, it doesn't, well, it probably, well, so like you could try, but it's probably wouldn't work all that well. Play dumb, well, that's always an option. And like we don't have really good options, because this one is sort of like even if those houses are empty, those are still someone's houses. So like you know, sending Russians into someone else's house is not a very good thing to do probably. Playing dumb is also risky, because they could think that something is up, and like this one is sort of unrealistic, I would say. So let's try to give them a false lead for all I know. I knew we wouldn't be pleased if I told him there were never any Nazis here, but what choice did I have? I couldn't throw my neighbors under the bus. Then again, many of them had left. I'd much prefer the Russians to wreck an empty house instead of shooting someone dead. There was a suspicious man around here, but we haven't seen him for a while now. I told the soldier the address of an empty house. But the rest of us are good folk. You won't find any Nazis among them. The soldier looked at me with a squint, then nodded. We'll check this information. You two stay put while we work. If you leave the basement, you're getting shot. When the Russians left, Lily closed the door behind them and looked at me in fear. What if they come back when they don't find anybody? I breathed out. My hands were shaking, but deep down I knew that I did the right thing. What was I supposed to do? At least this way they won't kill anybody. In reality, I wasn't sure of it at all. Also, Alexei is a bit in a better mood since he managed to avoid the difficult situation, I would say. Under fire. There was still fighting, but only on the outskirts. Lily had never gotten used to it, but I did. There is still fighting was something I kept telling myself as I saw Russians rummage through the houses on our street. A unit of Chechens, Kadyrovits, as they were called, even dropped by our wreck of a house. There wasn't much to steal, but they stole it anyway. Me and Lily had enough sense not to argue, so they just took what they wanted and left. The Mirzayans' turn hadn't come yet, but they knew they wouldn't be so lucky. That's why I couldn't refuse David when he asked that his daughter stay with us a few days. Me and Lila were just a tired old couple, and with my leg I wasn't much of a threat. The Russians were done with us. Thank you so much, Alexei. Those people are monsters, David shared as Lily helped Milena make her way into our basement. Have you heard the word around town? Of course I had. The Russians took whatever they wanted, they ate anything that could be eaten, drank anything that could be drank, and took anything they could resell back at home. I wasn't born yesterday, I expected as much. It was war and I could accept it. But what they did to women, I refused to accept. Are you sure you don't want to join us with Olga? We'll make room, I offered. He shook his head. No, Fedorovich, you just keep Milena hidden for a few days, okay? Me and Olga will manage somehow. We'll keep real quiet. He put his fingers to his lips and smiled. I smiled back at him as he walked out onto the street. I waved him goodbye. There was a pop, like a firecracker going off in the distance. David fell to the ground. He screamed. What I did next I could never be proud of. I threw myself towards the basement entrance and slammed the door shut. Downstairs, Lily yelped at the loud bang. My chest began to hurt and I clutched it with my hand. A second distant pop, the screaming stopped. I think I waited for hours. Milena was downstairs, covering her mouth and looking in mute horror, looking with David's eyes. I think I waited for hours. When I finally peeked through the door, slow and careful, making no sound, there was a David, alright, and two Russians, one standing over David and another rifling through his pockets. And what did you do that for? The standing one asked. He sounded calm, even bored. He was a Nazi, can't you tell? I know them when I see them. The other shrugged in the dark. He wasn't being serious, I could hear him grin. They laughed. They both lit themselves a cigarette. I closed the basement door and kept it closed through the night. Milena cried for hours. Lily held her hand and did her best not to cry too. But in the morning she too joined in when she heard Olga's wailing outside. In the morning there was fighting on the outskirts again, but closer to us. Sometimes bullets whizzed through the air right above our fence. When I opened the door to the basement, Olga crawled towards us on all fours, but something had to be done about David. So we have two options. I went to get a shovel, tried to give David a proper burial, or I didn't want anyone to join David. We had to wait for a better time. So let's bury David. I couldn't leave my friend like that, so I got a shovel and crawled towards David. As I dug a grave for him, I had to stop at least 24 times. The air would get too hot, the shots too loud, and the ground would shake so hard it knocked us all off our feet. In the end, it was barely a grave. David's broad Armenian shoulders barely fit in it. It seems like the earth itself refused to believe he was dead, but it had to suffice. And while it was little relief for the girls, we did David good. The dogs weren't going to get him. Supply rate. By the 10th day of war, our supplies were dwindling. Me and Lily always tried to manage with little excess and had very little food stocked up. Why would we? The shops nearby had everything we needed. But now there were twice as many of us. The Mirzayans brought some of their own supplies with them, but it wasn't enough for 4 people. Someone had to go get us some supplies. Lily didn't want to let me go. There was still fighting in Hostomel. Every day we heard explosions, machine gun fire and artillery barrages. My wife even wanted to go look for supplies by herself, but I managed to talk her out of it. If anybody was gonna take such a risk, it had to be me. I told her the Russians wouldn't give me a second thought. There was no use in shooting an old cripple. It would just be a waste of ammo. I wasn't a threat to them at all. I was trying to convince myself of this as much as her. Eventually, Lilia saw things my way, or pretended she did. Olga and Milena talked very little in these last few days. David's death was heavy on them. With him gone, they were on their own. I had a double responsibility now. Milena cried a lot. Looking at the dark circles under her eyes, I thought David should have taken her to someone else, someone stronger and healthier. When the gunfire outside had quieted down, I took my cane and grabbed my old backpack. Lily, stay quiet down here and keep everyone inside. I'll be back soon, I promise. I'll see if there is anything useful nearby and be right back. She nodded, barely holding back her tears. After what happened to David, she feared for my life even more. It was quiet outside, and after the dark, damp basement, the sunlight was blinding. When my eyes did adjust to it, I wish they didn't. Many houses on our street were ruined, either heavily damaged or simply gone. The intact ones had all been broken into and looted. The Russians took everything: clothing, household appliances, tools, even children's toys. I couldn't understand what kind of a person would do that. I saw ransacked cars everywhere. Many of them were even missing their wheels. Some were shot or flattened by armored vehicles. Inside one such car, I saw someone mangled remains. I looked away in horror and disgust. There was even a case, actually, in one of the districts of Kiev. Some small group of Russians managed to somehow sneak into the city and were running several APCs in one of the districts of Kiev. And actually there is a video of an old man driving his car, and then an enemy APC would just change its route so that it basically overruns the car, and so it went right on top of the car and kept moving. And miraculously the elderly person in the car survived. He was badly wounded, but he survived and was taken to hospital, and he survived that incident. But that was inside the Kiev, so the enemy divergent group was quickly eliminated, and the person could be taken to hospital. But in some other towns, there were no one to help inside, or to save or take them to hospital, etc. So the person wouldn't survive such situation, I think. The streets were also full of bodies. People in civilian clothing were strewn about among the derbies like broken dolls. I had no idea why they were killed. Were they in the wrong place at the wrong time, like David? Did they draw someone's anger? I refused to believe this was all happening on the streets of my Hostomel. And yet, I still had a task to complete. I had to decide what to look for. We had a pressing need for many things, but with my leg I could only manage a single purposeful trip. Well, we already have gas and we have alcohol, so it would make sense to look for medicine. I kept thinking about David. If he survived, we would have nothing to treat his wound with, so I needed to get some medicine first. There was a pharmacy not far from our house. I decided to look there and check the abandoned houses along the way. So that's actually like parts of pharmacy word in Ukrainian here, but some letters were dropped. And basically this art is based on real photos from that area, most of them taken by like a person our team knows, and basically he allowed us to use the photos he'd taken after the Hostomel was liberated. He went there and like documented everything, taking lots of photos. So we used those as a reference for all the artwork in the game. I decided to look there and check the abandoned houses along the way. Indeed, I managed to find some food and water there. Did that make me a looter? I hope not. I didn't want to think of myself as one, so I made an effort to remember which things I took and where. This way I could compensate my neighbors after the war. Although, honestly, I don't think anyone would be worried about that. I mean, people were really like trying to help each other, and if you could take something from someone, if you could call someone, I'm sure they would say, sure, take anything like you need to survive this like difficult time. If you don't mind, like don't worry about it, but you would often just like. So of course people like there was another problem with looters, like people taking advantage of police and other like forces being too busy with Russian invasion and trying to steal something. Like there were lots of looters in Kiev caught by civilians, and so everyone started, and like the police was too busy, so it was hard to collapse the police. Like possible, but not they wouldn't always come fast. So people would often just tie them to a tree with a tape. And leave them there until police arrives. And we've basically caught one such guy who was trying to steal bicycles from the house. Some drug addicted guy, basically. But he was living nearby, so it was some local guy just, trying to take advantage of the situation. So people tried to talk some sense into him, but I don't think it worked. And basically they let him go in the end. And next day we saw a photo of him tied to a tree in some other place. Like he probably after our house he went to some other place and tried to steal something and was caught there as well. So yeah, so the first like week was people were very for looters and were like organizing themselves because police was busy with more like serious problems as well as other services. So like people had to fend for themselves with such like looters. But I mean these are looters who try to, in areas that are not being occupied, trying to break into houses of people who were escaping the war and steal some goods. So this is different. Like here, Alexei is trying to find some things necessary to survive, and in an area that's under Russian occupation, so I wouldn't call him a looter at all. As expected, the pharmacy had been ransacked, shattered windows, wrecked turned over and broken cash registers. The Russians had already liberated the place and even threw themselves a little party. It seemed on the floor I saw empty bottles of ethanol. Eventually I did find an unopened bottle of ethanol enrolled under a rack, and I was the first one to find it. In the bag I found bandages and antibiotics. Thanking the Almighty for such great luck, I packed everything into my backpack and hurried back home. As I walked back home, the fighting resumed, and judging by the sounds, it was heading my way. I sped up to the best of my ability. A few times the explosions would ring out a single street away from me, making the ground shake under my feet. I wanted to drop the supplies and I found and tried to run, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't come back empty-handed. When I finally reached my home safely, I couldn't believe my luck. It was already getting dark outside, my leg was on fire, and my back was killing me. But Lily's adoring gaze made up for any discomfort. Her look made me feel like a young man in his prime again. For the first time in forever, I felt useful. The celebration. Mobile connection was down more often than it was not, and even then we had to go outside to catch any. But even so, the gossip spread quickly around Hostomel. The fighting had died down and the Russians had the free run of the town. And that's when the news started coming in. News I didn't want to believe. People said a man was shot for not showing the Russians his phone. Another man did show them his, and the Russians shot him over something they found in it. Another man was shot for wearing camouflage pants. Another for asking the soldiers what they were doing in Ukraine. I didn't know what to think of it. I didn't want to believe it. Most of the soldiers in the village were barely adults, yet those who shot David Mirzayan were barely adults too, and every night we heard more gunshots, and every night we heard women screaming. Poor Milena was terrified. She kept beating herself up over heading to Hostomel before the war. Kiev, we were told, was still holding out, but Hostomel, as we would find out soon, Hostomel was lost. Well, as I was in Kiev, they basically stopped like 3 kilometers from the city, so we're really close. And there were like artillery and missile strikes against the city, but apart from some like divergent groups, during the first days there were no enemy troops in Kiev, and those got quickly eliminated, so it was relatively safe apart from artillery and missile strikes. And there was like a month of artillery duels around Kiev when they were trying to attack from where like Hostomel, Bucha, big towns like suburbs of Kiev. So there was some heavier fighting with lots of artillery, rocket artillery and everything. And my colleagues, especially the ones that lived close to that direction, they couldn't sleep because like whole night there would be artillery barrages, like our troops firing and then the enemy return fire and so on. So it was really loud, and yeah, it was really scary. So around the months they were like really close to Kiev, but then they've got to retreat, basically. One evening we sat huddled in the basement, me, Olha, Lily and Milena, who hid in the furthest corner. Fearing the worst, we were always ready to hide her under the blankets, as if she wasn't here. And the Russians were rowdy that evening. Their gunfire and frenzied shouting echoed across the town. Suddenly we heard someone bang on the door, and mere seconds later it flew open. Milena hid herself immediately, and the rest of us jumped to our feet. We heard commotion coming from upstairs, from someone's slow and messy descent. A Russian. When he stumbled into the basement, I recoiled from the stench of sweat and alcohol. He could barely stand as he looked at us. His sleepy blue eyes were almost white. "Good evening. So, what's it gonna be?" he slurred, as if continuing a point he made before, somewhere upstairs, if not hours ago. "Are there any girls left in this town?" My heart sank. Lily and Ola just blinked at each other. The man stood at the exit, trapping us inside. His rifle was at his shoulder, way out of our reach. Then he moved across the basement towards the bedding where Milena was hiding. My heart sank. Luckily, Lilia spoke up. "What are you celebrating?" I was baffled at first, but then I put the dots together. The smell of alcohol and the shouts outside. The soldier was already barely standing when he came to us. As it turned out, that's why he went for the bedding. To land onto it was a loud, tired groan. I couldn't breathe from strain. Milena was barely a meter away from him, hidden under a pile of blankets. "We took Hostomel. Ha! We took everything up to Kiev. It's next. Soon your president." He grinned and drew his thumb across his dirt-caked neck. "Him and the rest of the fucking Nazis. We had to keep the boy distracted and get him to leave us alone as soon as possible." Okay, so we have several options. So we kept him talking. We needed him to lose focus, so we got him even more drunk. He was kneeling over already, just needed a little push. And so we offered him tea and sweets, whatever worked to distract him. So, well, this one is unavailable because we don't have sweets. But I guess we could make him even more drunk, so maybe he will forget why he came here. And will probably get us on his good side. Let's hope so. Okay, let's try. Lyosha, did you hear that? They've liberated Hostomel. Get our hero something to drink. Lily didn't need to ask me twice. Though we took out 4 cups, the Russian got most of the alcohol. He didn't resist, but he didn't insist, but he didn't protest either. The drink sedated him and loosened his tongue. And the stories he told us were awful. The boy didn't seem to come from a happy household, and his home village somewhere in North Russia was sparse on young women. He said he was conscripted a year ago and wasn't even supposed to be in Ukraine, but he was having the time of his life. Take whatever you want, eat whatever you want, fuck local girls, shoot every once in a while, and when I go back they'll give me a medal for it, he grinned. I wanted to strangle him. It lasted for so long, I was afraid Milena would suffocate under all the blankets, but she did well. She later told us she was shaking the whole time, but I didn't notice. And soon the Russian could hardly string words together. He leaned against the wall and his rifle belt started slipping from his shoulder. He barely even noticed. Just then we heard someone else walk through the open basement door. Another Russian, he too was armed. Seri, get the fuck up! Serge is looking for you. What the fuck are you doing here? Finding us some girls for the night, like yesterday. I told the fucking sergeant where I was going. The man got on his feet, grumbling under his breath. I winced at their cross exchange, but said nothing. It wasn't the time or place to tell youngsters to mind their language. Thankfully, the soldiers were about to leave anyway. Well, leave these fat old hacks alone, you idiot. We found someone younger. Milena loses hope. This event was caused by your previous action. So, basically, the way the novel is structured is that there are like events that go in a sequence, and then there are events that could be triggered literally like any time when you reach certain conditions. So when any of the characters' mood is down to 0, there is a special event happens, and you don't want Oleksandr to reach 0 because he would be despaired and that would affect the story. So try to keep everyone's mood as high as possible under the circumstances. Milena wasn't looking good. News were getting harder to come by, with everybody staying home and mobile connection failing us more often than not. But anytime we got the news, it was all worse than before. Lily and Olga could hardly calm her down. When they got together, they'd only magnify each other's fears. All they knew, if the Russians came for us, there would hardly be anything we could do about it. And even if I had a weapon, I was a tired old man. Nobody expected me to fight the entire Russian army. One night we all woke up hearing Russian vehicles moving on the road above. Even after they passed us, Milena couldn't sleep. She was afraid to move or even breathe. I had to distract her somehow. Well, there are several options, but we don't have sweets and alcohol, and I think drinking alcohol here is also not the best thing. So I talked to her all night. As long as I had some strength left, I had to share it. I settled in the corner next to Milena and tried to get her to talk. It was slow going at first, but I suppose I was non-threatening enough that she started to open up. She told me how much she hated the Russians, how much they took from her family already. She told me how much she missed her father, how when she was little he tried his best to keep her from finding out about death. Whenever her pets disappeared, it was because they made some miraculous escape to the hamster land or rabbit land, wherever they would be happier. She was right. David was a good man, and he didn't deserve what happened to him, not one bit. When she cried, I hugged her and did my best not to join in. Eventually, Milena fell asleep. I covered her up the best I could and tried to rise to my feet, but I couldn't. I had too little strength left in me. Eventually, I drifted to sleep on the floor. Next morning, my back was not thankful for it. In the end, I managed to shield Milena from this war a little bit, and that's what mattered. The Mirzayan's escape. It was the second week of war. 2 days ago, an artillery shell hit the substation on the street next to ours, and since then we had no electricity. To cook or boil water, I had to build a fire in our backyard. Olga and Milena was fixing to try and evacuate. I am telling you, there won't be a better time. What if the Russians come back to look for girls again? We won't be so lucky a second time. After that case, Milena wouldn't leave the basement anymore. She shuddered at any noise, and no matter how she tried to hide it, I knew she was having nightmares every night. I didn't sleep well either. Memories of that evening kept surfacing. The mere thought of what would have happened if the drunk Russian found Milena made me sick to my stomach. We were lucky our Katya left for Lviv a long time ago. The Russians would never reach her there, and I thanked God for it every day. Ola, we've talked about it. It's too dangerous. Those Russians are firing at any car they see. Lily was against doing anything rash. She insisted that we wait for the official evacuation corridor. The problem was we didn't know if or when there would be any. It can't possibly be more dangerous than staying here, Olga insisted. She was always a good mother to Milena, and after David's death, I could understand her feelings. Living in constant fear for a child, wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. If you want to sit and wait, that's fine, but we are leaving today. The conversation was over, and the Mirzayans went to pack up their things. In about an hour they were ready to leave. We went out into the yard not knowing what to say or do. It was a strange feeling looking at our friends and wondering if we would see them ever again. In the last few weeks, the Mirzayans became like family to us. A shared hardship made us close. We hugged them and said our goodbyes. Lily hurried back into the basement. I think she didn't want me to see her tears. She became quite fond of Milena. I thought I'd miss her too. Our days would be even darker without her occasional smile. We were both so sad to do anything in the evening, so we went to sleep early, and in the morning we were woken up by loud screams from the outside. It was Milena, she was calling for help. Me and Lily ran out into the yard and saw her. She was barely standing on her feet, holding up her mother, whose clothes were stained with blood. Olga looked pale, and her left hand hung limp along her body. Oh my god, Milena, what happened? Lily rushed to help the crying girl. I limped right after to support Olga. My leg hurt like hell, but it was the least of my concerns at the time. There was a Russian PTR. They were fired on us. The girl was in shock and barely stringed words together. There's bodies on the streets with tight hands like they were executed. Her shoulders shook and she balled into her hands. Me and Lily exchanged shocked glances. We heard gunfire every night, but we couldn't even imagine something like this. My wife came to her senses first. Lyosha, bring her downstairs. I have to take a look at her wound. Okay, so here we basically have different options depending on what we have. So luckily we have medicine, so we can treat the wound properly. Back in the basement we put Olga down on a mattress and turned on a flashlight to see what we were dealing with. That's when Lila's first aid courses came in handy. Lyosha, get the med kit, we must clean and dress the wound. Watching Lily work, I tried to calm Milena down. Don't worry, honey, Mom will be alright. We have the medicine, it will help. Well, we helped Olga, so... The evacuation. It's been a few days since Olga was wounded. She was in the clutches of fever and Lily kept by her side, keeping a cold rag on her forehead. It barely helped. Olga needed medicine and professional medical help. At some point, I even tried pleading with the Russians, asking if they could help. They just laughed. They said they wouldn't waste medicine on us, even if they had enough of it themselves. From the looks of it, their special military operation against Ukraine wasn't going according to plan. What little news we kept getting suggested that the Russians weren't making any progress. Our military stopped their advance completely, and the recruitment stations had civilians queuing up to them. The people said there were more Ukrainian volunteers and weapons to give them. Despite constant rocket strikes and shellings of peaceful cities, Ukraine held fast. But those weren't all the news. For the last few days, rumors had begun to spread about another occupied town nearby, Bucha. What the Russians did to its citizens was beyond my comprehension. Even the Nazis' occupation from my father's occasional stories couldn't compare to the senseless cruelty of the Russian military and the ones in Hostomel kept telling us that they came to liberate their brother people. So far, mass murder, torture and rape were all I'd seen or heard about the Russian world they were so eager to bring us into. Back home, I saw Lily and Milena having a cup of tea and talking about something. After all the stress she's been through, Milena spoke with a stammer and cried more often than not. Bubbly and full of life before the war, now Milena was a shadow of her former self. Luckily, my wife had worked with children her entire life, being a school teacher. Milena wasn't a child, but Lily still managed to get through to her like she always did to anyone. Now Lily was telling Milena a funny story about our own daughter, and as it turned out, she spent the night at her friend's house. You don't understand, we had the entire town looking for her, and she just had the sound on her phone disabled. Oh, children. Milena smiled a little, and it was her first smile since the incident with her mother. I was glad to see her coming back to life bit by bit. I smiled at the story as well and checked my phone. It suddenly had a weak connection, and anytime I caught any, I tried to keep with this news, and I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw it. Evacuation, Lily! An official evacuation from Hostomel. The basement went quiet. Lily and Milena looked up at me with round eyes, and even Olga seemed to perk up a little. Tomorrow at noon there will be an evacuation corridor for civilians, either by car or by bus. They'll be waiting at the outskirts of town. Milena looked at her mother, then at me. We're going, right? Mom needs to see a doctor. Me and Lily exchanged glances. Leaving our house behind was scary, but we couldn't stay, especially after the news from Bucha. We immediately had a silent understanding. Lily stroked Milena on the head. Of course, honey. Tomorrow night we'll all be safe. The rest of the day was spent packing up for departure, and by morning we were ready. Well, so here basically two ways to leave, like by car if you have fuel, or by bus if you don't. So we can go by car. We decided to go by car, that way we'd be able to take more supplies and get to our destination faster. In times of war, transport would become an issue, and with my leg reaching the evacuation buses with an injured woman in tow, we ran the risk of not making it. We loaded everything up into the car and looked at our house for the last time. We've lived there for the better part of our lives, and leaving it behind was tough. The Mirzayans had it even worse. They weren't only living their town in Hostomel, they were leaving David. We set out with a heavy heart. The ruined and looted Hostomel outside was a scene straight from a horror movie. On the outskirts we passed a Russian checkpoint. They checked our papers and looked inside the car, but decided to let us through. Soon we joined the evacuation convoy on the highway, and I began to feel the dread, my constant companion for the last 2 weeks, dissipate. So basically we got out and we treated Olga's wound properly. Safe at last. I could scarcely remember the road to Kiev. I think the entire time we were on the road I kept looking out of the window, and the only thing I remembered were destroyed Russian vehicles. Lots of them. A whole damn lot. At a certain point I was so overcome by anger I wanted to limp my way back to Hostomel and strangle every single one responsible for my town's ruin. But this anger passed quickly when I looked Lily, Olga and Milena peaceful at long last. For the first time in 2 weeks we had nothing to fear. In Kiev we immediately took Olga to the hospital. As it turned out, Lily learned a lot from her first aid courses. She did a good job cleaning and dressing the wound. Olga was on the road to recovery. While we sat at the hospital, Milena found us a train schedule, and in the evening we were already at the railway station. We had to wait for a bit, but eventually we managed to board an evacuation train headed west. It was a long journey, about 13 hours in a cramped train car, but it was nothing compared to what we've already survived by then. Next day we were in Lviv, where our Katya met us along with her fiancé. I don't think I have ever been happier. My wife and daughter held each other and cried, while I looked at the passing cars and people walking around with their children. I couldn't believe my eyes. We were in a peaceful city. We were safe at last. Epilogue. The town of Hostomel fell under attack from the first day of the war. Its Antonov International Airport made the prime target of the invasion, as it would have allowed the Russian army to continuously airdrop personnel and vehicles to the outskirts of Kiev. By the time the Russians managed to take the airport, it was rendered inoperable. Russian troops first set foot in Hostomel on February 25, 2022, but encountered fierce resistance. By March 5, 2022, however, the towns of Hostomel and Bucha were under complete occupation. This put the Russian military in position to threaten the city of Kiev. Only the heroic defense of the Ukrainian armed forces prevented the disaster. Hostomel would only be liberated on April 2, 2022. Over the full months of occupation, the Russian armed forces have committed a large number of war crimes, including looting, summary execution, forced deportation, and rape. These events have been corroborated by satellite footage, eyewitness accounts, and intercepted communications. The actions of the Russian troops are considered to be a genocide. The exact number of victims is still being established. Officially, over 400 people from Hostomel remain missing. As of May 2022, the Kiev Oblast has been completely liberated and people are starting to return. But in the south and the east, the war continues. The end is not currently in sight. Well, so that's my playthrough of the demo of the Ukraine war stories. It's basically the full first story. This will be the same in the full game, so you can play the demo and read the story and see the different outcomes. There are 2 more stories coming up and we'll be waiting for you in October during the full release. Our team couldn't sit idly by when the war was raging in Ukraine, and you know, we are in Kiev, and you know, all our like relatives, friends, people we know got affected in different ways, and we thought since we are like our craft is making computer games, we should do such charity projects that will be totally free and tell people around the world about the events in Ukraine in more detail. And we've made sure that everything was very accurate and true to the events that actually happened. That's why we have this sources section in the main menu, and we also plan to add the donate buttons, but we won't be gathering any donations. Those would go directly to the funds, like well-known charity funds that manage that. So we will not be having any money go through us. I will just let people know where if you want you could donate, if you don't want you don't have to. Basically that's our small part in that we would want to play in the events that are unfolding, and we think it's necessary that these stories are getting documented and, saved for future as well in such form. So we've decided to spend some basically time and money and make this project and translate it to 8 different languages. So right now the demo don't have all the languages, but they will be gradually added, and maybe when you are watching this they are already in. So the game at release will have 8 languages that are listed on the store page, so go check them out. I would also ask of you to add the game to your wish lists and maybe recommend it to your friends or people you know, like help us spread information about it, because word of mouth is the best thing we can hope for in letting everyone know about this project, and we think it's really important. It's probably more important than any of our other projects in that regard, that it's has big social value, and we think it's important for people across the world to know what happens in Ukraine. So please help us spread the information, and even if that's just adding the game to your wishlist, that's already a big deal, because as I've said, like the more people wishlist the game, the more attention it will get during its release in October, and the more people on Steam will learn about it. And it's like not about selling the game, it's free, it's not about like anything like that. We just want to get as much people as possible to know, like as many people as possible to learn about this project and about what's happening in Ukraine. So please help us with spreading the information and give it a try. I know it's probably a tough read, but we are trying to find a balance between being true to the events and not making it overly harsh on the reader. So we try to box this narrow line between being too gruesome and between not showing how horrific the events really were. So we hope that it's just right and we've been true to what happened without like going into unnecessary cruel gruesome details. So everyone have enough imagination to understand what it was really like to be there. So yeah. And so here you can see the sources, and these are only for Gostomel stories. So for Bucha and for Mariupol there would be different tabs that you can move between and read the sources for all the key events in the story. We also plan to add some form of a button so in this main menu there will be added a donation section that would basically recommend people where they can donate if they want to, and those would be some world recognized organizations that are in charge of helping Ukraine. Yeah, so that was it. I hope I'll be doing more broadcasts on our other titles as well. I really wasn't in a situation to make those live streams ever since war has started, because I was feeling that the development of all our games was like more important, and it was taking all of my free time basically. But now things have settled out a little bit, and now I finally have some time to spend during the weekend to record these broadcasts for you. And so I hope to see everyone during some other broadcasts. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us or to go to the game community hub and discuss it with Starni team and with other Steam community members, or go to our Discord server. So as always, we are really open and we are happy to improve the project and to discuss it with you. And most important, to know your thoughts. It's really important when people, like, there are already a few reviews on several reviews on our Steam community hub, and it's always very enlightening to read those, because it's really important for us as designers to understand how people perceive what we do. And so far we've got mostly positive feedback, but I mean, it doesn't matter, any feedback is most welcome, so please come to our Steam community hub and let us know what you think about the demo once you've played it. Yeah, so see you next time, guys. Hopefully we'll get through all of these difficult times alive, and yeah, see you on the next broadcast. Have a good day and stay safe.